Hello, my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is Stephen Dalton. I'm an Irish storyteller, and it's my great privilege to be the voice that you listen to as you go to sleep tonight. Tonight, I continue my incredibly dull history series, and tonight we look at something quite apt for my channel, sleep. Now, personally, I love sleep. Right now, I'm sitting in my studio, recording this for you, feeling incredibly sleepy myself. I've been trying a new sleep routine, and my body is getting used to it. And that is also quite apt for this story, as we will look at all sorts of sleep routines throughout the ages. I love to hear from you. Where are you in the world as you go to sleep tonight? And what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's do the relaxation session now, which will take a few minutes before tonight's sleep story. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1, and as I do, allow yourself to let go more and more. 10. Feel the support of the bed beneath you, or the floor, or whatever surface you lie upon tonight. And beneath all of that, feel the support of the earth, our home. From the earth we receive a constant support. And as you become aware of that feeling of being supported, see if you can let go a little more now. Releasing tension, letting go. A little more now. 9. Feel into your body. Where are you still holding? Where do you feel tension? Maybe you feel pain. Maybe it's in your feet, in your lower legs. In your thighs, in your belly, in your chest, maybe you're like me, and you hold a lot of tension in your hands or in your face. See if you can let that tension go now. Just by becoming aware of it, we can ease the tension. 8. You are safe. Allow my voice to be an anchor of safety tonight, to be a friend. Know that my voice will only ever take you to safe places, and allow that fact, that feeling of trust, to enable you to let go a little more now. 7. The day is done. Whatever has been, has been. Whatever will be, will be. Whatever thoughts you might be having, know them for what they are, just thoughts. Don't judge them, positively or negatively. Know that they are not you. They are a symptom of being a human. And as they arrive, see them, but there's no need to follow them. Watch them go, floating away, like leaves on a moonlit river, or clouds passing through a starlit sky. 6. This is your moment. This is your time. You deserve rest. We all do. So as you move deeper and deeper towards deep rest tonight, know this: you deserve this rest as much as anyone else. 5. Peace lives within you. It is always there. It is a constant friend. A constant presence. It's just waiting to be found, waiting to be felt. See where you can find your peace tonight. 4. Perhaps allow a little gratitude now. Gratitude for the simple things, for this moment of peace, for the shelter you have tonight, for the breath in your body. 3. Begin to engage with your imagination now. Begin to be curious about sleep. The millions of people in history who have laid on surfaces and gone to sleep. 2. Checking in with your body one more time now. Your body has worked hard for you today. It's time to give it rest. And 1. Completely letting go now, as I tell you tonight's sleep story. Let us begin. if you can stay awake long enough, with one of the most thoroughly unremarkable activities in the history of the human species: sleep. People have been doing it for thousands of years. Quite badly, most of the time. Now sleep, despite its apparent importance, is one of the few things in life that has resisted almost all attempts at improvement. For centuries, humans have built better boats, faster shoes, taller churches, and noisier clocks. But sleep, as it turns out, remains stubbornly sleep-shaped. Before mattresses, there were sacks of hay. Before those, it was just ground. And before that, no one really knows. But it was probably someone lying underneath a very flat rock, trying not to think about how long the night would last. Because make no mistake, night has always been long, and humans have always found it just slightly too long to enjoy without some measure of fuss. You see, most people imagine that sleep has always been one long, uninterrupted stretch. Not so. In the Middle Ages, it was common, particularly in colder parts of Europe, for people to sleep in two parts: a first sleep, followed by a second sleep, with an hour or two of sitting in between. Sitting. Just sitting. Perhaps poking at the fire, or saying a prayer, or wondering if the cow was still breathing. Sometimes writing letters that no one would read. That was the golden age of night thinking, if you ask me. Absolutely useless time. Delightful. But even before the two-sleep era, before candles, before bedrooms, before the word sleep itself existed in anything resembling its current shape, people were already lying down in the dark, closing their eyes, and trying not to dream of damp weather and the neighbor's elbows. And that, more or less, is where our story begins. Part 1. Mesopotamia, and the soft beginnings of thoughtful sleep. The earliest known written references to sleep appear, as many things do, in the ancient land of Mesopotamia, a region where people had an unusual enthusiasm for documenting things on clay tablets, including grain rations, rainfall, minor border disputes, and occasionally the behavior of sleep. Now, Mesopotamians did not have a word for sleep, in quite the same way we think of it today. What they had were references, gentle passing mentions in epic poems, personal records, and inscriptions of people resting, reclining, or simply withdrawing for a while. It's clear that people lay down at night, usually indoors, often on mats or piles of reeds, and that they considered it an ordinary part of life. In fact, most of what we know about Mesopotamian sleep can be inferred from how little they said about it, which, if anything, suggests it went reasonably well. Clay tablets from as far back as 2000 BCE describe domestic routines in peaceful, practical terms. The evening meal, the sweeping of the floor, the placing of oil lamps near the door, and then, usually, a single line, "He rested," or "She lay down," and that was that. No elaborate description, no fuss. Sleep was seen as something that followed naturally once one had eaten, spoken with family, and perhaps looked at the stars for a bit. In larger Mesopotamian homes, those of scribes, merchants, or people who were unusually good at storing barley, sleeping areas were often near the inner walls of the home, where it stayed cool. There are archaeological records of low platforms made of mud brick, likely used for reclining or sleep, sometimes raised slightly to keep off the dust. Softness, when available, came from bundles of woven reeds, sometimes stuffed loosely with wool and covered with cloth, if one was fortunate. People did not sleep alone unless they lived alone. In nearly all households, sleep was a communal act. Parents, children, cousins, visiting aunties, and perhaps a goat would all settle into their corners of the room as the lamps were dimmed and the breeze moved gently through the open shutters. There is no indication that anyone found this strange. It was simply how one rested, with others nearby, the night slowly folding over everyone at once. And while we cannot say exactly what Mesopotamians believed happened during sleep, we do know that they treated it with respect. Rest was considered necessary, not dramatic, not symbolic, just part of being a person. If you lived in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, and you had completed your work, spoken kindly, and eaten your lentils, you would lie down on your mat, under your cloth, and close your eyes, and that would be enough. Part 2. Egypt and the considerable elegance of lying still. If the Mesopotamians treated sleep as a practical necessity, the ancient Egyptians treated it as a quiet occasion, something one approached with a little more ceremony, or at the very least, with better linen. Egyptians, especially those with access to a bit of comfort and woven flax, believed in preparation. One did not simply collapse into a corner. One lay down with purpose. In fact, there are paintings from as far back as 1400 BCE showing people reclining in that elegant, faintly overposed way that only ancient Egyptians could manage. Straight-backed, legs together, arms neatly in place, as if preparing for a very slow parade that never quite started. What we know about Egyptian sleep comes from both the practical and the decorative, from grave goods, household objects, and an uncommonly high number of wooden headrests. These were shaped like gentle half-moons, balanced on short pedestals, designed to support the neck and keep carefully styled hair from being flattened overnight. They were not especially soft, but they were considered useful, hygienic, and perhaps most importantly, upright. The Egyptians liked things to remain upright. Now, this does not mean they didn't value comfort. On the contrary, they produced excellent linen sheets, and their homes were often oriented to catch the breeze at night. The walls were thick, the floors cool, and water jars left in doorways would add a little moisture to the air, if there is such a thing as ancient air conditioning. The Egyptians nearly invented it with a pot. There are records, charmingly indirect, of what we might call bedtime routines. Oil applied to the skin, hands washed in bowls of water, perfume cones set in dishes by the bed, slowly releasing scent into the night. And while the papyrus scrolls do not say and then she went to sleep. We can assume that after all that oiling, rinsing, and arranging of cones, one was probably ready to lie down for a while. Sleep itself was seen, again, as a natural part of the human rhythm. It was not something to be conquered or analyzed. If you were tired, you rested. If it was evening, you went inside. And if the stars were out, you looked at them for a bit, then pulled your linen up to your chest and decided to let the world turn without you for a few hours. This was not laziness. This was simply the understanding that the body, like the Nile, had a rhythm of its own. It worked, it flowed, it stopped. And when it stopped, gently, without complaint, it was time to sleep. Part 3. Ancient Greece, or how to fall asleep while thinking about falling asleep. Sleep in ancient Greece was not only a bodily function, it was a matter of considerable philosophical interest. This was a culture in which men in togas sat under olive trees, debating the nature of wind, the ethics of soup, and whether one could truly know a chair. Naturally, sleep was bound to come up, and when it did, opinions multiplied. To begin with, the Greeks gave us Hypnos, the god of sleep. He lived, according to Hesiod, in a dark cave where no light ever entered, and where everything was extremely quiet. His home was surrounded by poppies and herbs, said to induce drowsiness, a sort of celestial nap garden. Hypnos was gentle and unassuming. He appears frequently in Greek myth as a helpful sort of figure. When Hera wanted to distract Zeus, for instance, she asked Hypnos to make him drowsy, which worked briefly until Zeus woke up and wasn't pleased. Still, Hypnos did his best. He was thought to gently close the eyes of the weary and guide people toward rest, which is a service most of us still appreciate, especially around 3:45 a.m., when the ceiling seems particularly conversational. But the myths were just the beginning. The philosophers weighed in too. Aristotle, in his treatise on sleep and sleeplessness, had a theory. Naturally, he believed that sleep was caused by vapors. Yes, vapors rising from food during digestion. These warm, damp vapors were thought to ascend from the stomach to the head, where they cooled and condensed around the brain, slowing it down like a wet sponge. This, according to Aristotle, was the mechanism of sleep. In modern terms, one might say, soup makes you sleepy because steam goes to your brain. It was a simpler time. Plato, on the other hand, thought sleep was the result of the soul withdrawing inward, like a snail. He wasn't entirely sure where it went, but he seemed comfortable with the idea that it simply needed some time alone. This, if nothing else, makes him one of the earliest known supporters of personal space. The Stoics, ever the minimalists, didn't focus much on sleep in their writings, but they did respect it as a part of nature's rhythm. Epictetus, for example, advised people to live in harmony with what was natural, which included sleeping at night, eating modestly, and not making too much of a fuss when things didn't go your way, such as when your neighbor's donkey refused to settle down. It's worth noting that none of the Stoics left detailed instructions on how to fall asleep, which suggests they either had excellent sleep hygiene or were simply too polite to complain. The physician Galen, who admittedly came a little later in the Roman period, but trained in Greek traditions, continued Aristotle's vapor theory and added that sleep was necessary to restore balance to the humors. These were bodily fluids thought to control temperament and health, including blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If one was short on phlegm, for instance, a nap might help. Galen also advised sleeping on the right side to aid digestion, and suggested that one should never go to sleep angry, bloated, or after excessive flute playing. As for everyday Greeks, they seem to have gone to bed more or less like anyone else. After supper, once the sun had dipped, with shutters closed to keep out the chill. Poorer households slept together in shared rooms, while wealthier ones had private chambers. There's little indication that anyone made a grand ceremony of sleep itself, but they did value rest, particularly the midday nap, a practice known as the mesembrine anapausis, a term which, like many Greek words, sounds far more dramatic than the thing it describes, which was sitting in the shade for 20 minutes possibly with a fig. There is even evidence that dream incubation was practiced in temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing. Asclepius, you might know, was something of a celebrity in the world of ancient Greek mythology. A doctor so good at healing, the gods got nervous. The legend goes that he became so proficient at curing ailments and reviving the sick that Hades, the god of the underworld, and not exactly known for his patience, lodged a formal complaint with Zeus, arguing that if Asclepius wasn't stopped, the underworld would be completely out of business by spring. Zeus, being prone to thunderous decisions, solved the problem by hurling a lightning bolt at Asclepius. This was, even by Olympian standards, a bit much, but in a twist that says a lot about ancient Greek career trajectories, Asclepius was instantly promoted to godhood and given his own temples, where people came not to be struck by lightning, but to fall asleep. Yes, sleep, because the Greeks, ever inventive, created a practice called incubation. Ah yes, that's where I was, which involved curling up inside a temple dedicated to Asclepius and nodding off in the hopes of receiving a divine diagnosis via dream. You'd show up with your ailment, bad knees, plague spots, unusual twitching, then have a nice snooze on a stone bench while the god popped into your dreams and told you what herbs to boil, which goat to avoid, or which relative was secretly poisoning your figs. People came from all across the Greek world for these temple sleeps. There are dusty inscriptions listing grateful patients and their divine prescriptions. One man claimed Asclepius healed his hemorrhoids with a sacred sponge. Another said he had gone blind in one eye and woke up to find the god had spit in it, successfully. No one questioned this. Ancient Greece was like that. And so, sleep, in that world, was more than just a way to avoid chores or digest olives. It was a doorway to divine consultation, a slow, temple-sanctioned path to wellness, in which a good nap might literally change your life, or at the very least give you a good story to tell the neighbors. Part 4. Ancient Rome. The Empire takes a nap. By the time the Roman Empire came along, sleep had become something both practical and politely scheduled. The Romans, as a rule, liked order. They liked to label things. They built straight roads, divided the day into tidy segments, and gave official names to everything, including the nap. The meridiatio was the Roman version of the afternoon rest, taken shortly after the midday meal, not because it was sacred, not because a god told them to, but because after a plate of lentils and half a loaf of olive bread, even the most ambitious Roman senator was ready to stretch out for a bit. In the countryside, people dozed beneath shady trees or inside stone farmhouses, while in the cities, wealthier Romans retreated to quiet rooms called cubicula, sleeping chambers tucked away from the noise of the street. Some rooms had shutters to keep out the light, and the more fashionable sorts stuffed their pillows with wool, feathers, or soft reeds. Sleep was seen as restorative, especially if it didn't last too long. Doctors of the time advised against excessive napping, warning that it could cause sluggishness, or, in one particularly stern medical scroll, a heaviness of the limbs most unbecoming to a man of Rome. No one knew exactly what that meant, but people tried not to risk it. Still, a short nap was considered wise. Cicero, the famous orator, wrote that he liked to sleep briefly after lunch before returning to his writing. Seneca, the philosopher, said that sleep should neither be pursued too greedily nor feared like death. And Pliny the Elder, who had opinions on absolutely everything, once claimed that people who slept outdoors under the moonlight were more likely to develop softness of the mind. Whether he meant this medically or poetically is still debated by historians who have themselves slept very little. Now, although Romans were early risers and keen nappers, they also appreciated a proper night's sleep, especially once the lamps were dimmed and the city began to settle. In wealthier homes, people slept on wooden bed frames called lecti, strung with rope or leather strips, and piled with mattresses filled with wool or straw. Some were stuffed with feathers, though this was seen as a bit extravagant unless you were a consul or someone who owned at least one marble fountain shaped like Neptune. Bedding was simple: linen in warmer months, wool in colder ones. The ideal Roman bed was neither too soft nor too firm, and it never squeaked. In humbler homes, people slept on mats rolled out on the floor, often shared by several family members. Privacy was not a major concern, though snoring was a common source of complaint, particularly in tenement buildings where the walls were thin and goats downstairs had opinions. Night time in Rome was never completely silent. there were echoes from the streets, the rattle of cart wheels on stones, the clink of oil lamps being trimmed, and occasionally a very determined cat disputing territory with another very determined cat. But there were also softer sounds, someone singing an old song under their breath, the hush of sweeping brooms, the faint gurgle of a fountain. For many, these were the lullabies of the city. Before sleep, it was common to rub the feet with scented oil, drink a bit of warm milk with honey, or recite a few lines of poetry, especially something from Virgil, who had a way of making even heroic battles sound oddly relaxing. Children were often told gentle stories, or sung to by their mothers, and some adults, especially older ones, had the habit of dozing off mid-conversation, which was considered both charming and practical. So, Roman sleep, like everything else in the empire, had its place, structured, timed, and, when possible, comfortably arranged. It may not have been sacred, as it was to the Greeks, but it was respected, and for many, it was the quietest part of the day, a little pause between empires rising and empires falling, between speeches and sandals and the sun coming up again. Part 5. The quiet hours of the Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, that is to say, the period between the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the sudden realization that it was already the High Middle Ages, people slept differently than we do now. And by differently, we mostly mean twice. What we now think of as an uninterrupted 8 hours was not at all the norm for several hundred years. Instead, people observed a practice now known as segmented sleep, not because they meant to, but because it simply happened, over and over again, night after night, until it became normal. It went something like this. The sun would set, as it still does, and people would go to bed, though they wouldn't say bed. They'd say to rest, or to lie. They would then have what was called a first sleep, which typically lasted from sunset until somewhere around midnight. At that point, they would wake up, but not in a panicked, alarm-clocked way, more in the style of someone quietly blinking at the ceiling and thinking, well, that's that for now. The waking interval, lasting 1 or 2 hours, was considered a natural part of the night. It was used, depending on one's circumstances, for prayer, mending, stoking the fire, or just having a think. Certain theologians claimed it was the best time to speak to God, and others claimed it was the best time to tend to pigs. And after this came the second sleep, which, despite the numbering, was not considered inferior to the first. In fact, it was sometimes described as the more restful of the two, though that may have had something to do with the fire being newly stoked, and everyone having finished their mending. In monasteries, this segmented pattern was amplified by the rule of Saint Benedict, who instructed monks to wake for matins in the very small hours, around 2 or 3 in the morning, and then return to sleep after. This was done in silence, usually with cold feet, and always with a great deal of sincerity. Monks were not encouraged to sleep too much, but they were also not meant to be awake in a way that caused pride. As such, their nights were carefully structured, with bells ringing at intervals that made perfect sense to the bell ringer, and absolutely no one else. Most monks, if asked, would have admitted to feeling perpetually halfway through a nap. It was, in many ways, the ideal spiritual state. Outside the monastery walls, folk traditions thrived in the dark. There were widespread beliefs about the dangers of too much sleep, which could invite laziness, or worse, attract the attention of wandering thoughts. This was the medieval notion that if your mind wandered too freely in the night, it might forget to come back. To counter this, families developed rituals, a quiet prayer whispered before sleep, a little iron key placed on the table, a pot of water left by the door, just in case, though no one ever said what for. And always, always the importance of being east, if you could. It wasn't required, but it helped. In the countryside, it was understood that sleep was not so much a private act as it was a shared rhythm. The entire village quieted together, stirred together, and returned to rest together. It was not unusual for someone to rise during the waking hour and find the neighbor's candle flickering across the way, a reminder that sleep, like waking, was a communal thing. And so they slept, twice a night, every night, for centuries, without alarms, without smartphones, without any real reason to change, until someone invented artificial light, and everything got rather rushed again. Part 6. Monastic Sleep, or How Not to Enjoy a Nap. To sleep in a medieval monastery was to surrender oneself, not to comfort, nor to dreams, but to timetables. The monks, bless them, did not think of sleep as something one ought to enjoy. In fact, if you were too comfortable, it was likely a sign that you were up to no good, and there were rules in some orders forbidding laughter in bed, lest it lead to temptation. Laughter in the 9th century was a slippery slope. Most monastic orders followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which, among many other things, said that monks should rise in the dead of night for prayer, not sunrise, not shortly before breakfast, but rather something past 2 in the morning, just when one might be entering a dream about eating warm cheese on a hill. The night office was called matins, though depending on your region, it might also be called vigils, nocturnes, or, less formally, that blasted bell again. The bell was the alarm clock of the monastery, though unlike your smartphone alarm, it could not be snoozed by flinging it across the room. It rang, whether you were ready or not, because the man whose job it was to ring it had already been awake for half an hour, practicing his humility. Now, let us briefly consider the monk who rang the bell. This was usually a younger monk, keen to impress, often chosen for his reliability and failure to oversleep. There is a story, possibly exaggerated, of a monk in the 11th century who rang the bell early by accident and woke the entire abbey 1 hour ahead of schedule. He was so distraught by this lapse in time discipline that he begged to be reassigned to cabbage washing for the rest of the year. The abbot agreed. No one overslept again. Once roused, the monks shuffled silently into the chapel in their habits, which were long woolen robes with hoods, useful for covering one's face if the prayer went on too long and a little sleep crept in around the edges. There were rules about posture: no slumping, no leaning, and absolutely no horizontal monks. If one nodded off mid-prayer, a fellow monk might give him a gentle poke with the finger, or, in stricter orders, with a small stick known as the discipline rod, not designed to hurt, merely to humiliate. After prayers, they might return to sleep, or they might go straight into manual labor, depending on the hour and how much gardening was urgently required. Sleep was divided, interrupted, resumed, and then interrupted again by lords, prime, terce, and so on. An endless chain of prayers and bells, until you eventually found yourself back at Vespers, wondering when the last time was that you actually slept through the night. And yet, monks were oddly fond of their routines. There are letters from the period in which monks describe their sleep as well ordered, which is the sort of thing only monks and German train conductors say about rest. In fact, some monks believed that to sleep too long was to practice a kind of spiritual selfishness, as if you were hoarding rest like coins. One particularly dour monk in 10th century Normandy wrote that he had reduced his nightly sleep to 4 hours and took no pleasure in dreams. He died shortly afterward, though whether from sanctity or sheer exhaustion, no one could say. The point is, he meant well. Part 7. The Nuns Who Slept on Purpose. Contrary to the popular image of nuns as silent, floating figures moving about candle-lit corridors in permanent prayer, many medieval nuns were remarkably pragmatic, especially when it came to sleep. They did not view it as a weakness to be overcome, nor even as a slippery slope to scandal, though scandal, to be fair, was always a concern. Rather, sleep was a tool, a thing to be managed, like beeswax or boiled linen or a troubled bishop. Nunneries, like monasteries, followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which, as we've established, did not exactly encourage lie-ins. But while some male monasteries interpreted rising for matins as a chance to clang about and show off their piety by being the first to the chapel, many nunneries adopted a quieter approach. They still woke for matins. Of course they did. They were devout. But there are accounts of matins being conducted while still sitting in bed, or kneeling quietly by the bedside, whispering psalms under one's breath, so as not to wake Sister Margaret, who was finally getting some rest after coughing all week. There was even one abbess in 12th century Burgundy who rewrote the matins schedule entirely, shifting it to just before dawn. Her reasoning being that God, having invented sunrise, probably wouldn't mind. Now, let us pause for a moment to consider the nun's chamber, or dormitorium. It was, like most things in a convent, cleaner, quieter, and better organized than its male counterpart. There are documented cases of nuns sewing small linen pillows stuffed with lavender to help them sleep, not because it was luxurious, but because it discouraged lice, and because it was nice. Being devout did not mean being a martyr to discomfort. That, many believed, was what the monks were for. Sleep in the nunneries often came after a great deal of work. These were not idle women. They copied manuscripts, tended gardens, taught girls, boiled herbs, and wrote letters to bishops asking why they hadn't sent the promised cheese. One letter from a convent in Flanders includes the phrase, "We remain in Christ's peace, though we are very short on ink and sleep." Some nuns, especially the older ones, became quite attached to their sleep. There is a delightful note in a 14th century visitation record in England mentioning Sister Elfrida, who had been reprimanded for snoring during Lauds. She replied, apparently without irony, that "the Lord knows I mean well, but the bell is too sudden." It was decided she would be allowed to sit closer to the chapel door, so she could sleep just a little longer and still arrive on time. This was viewed as merciful. In many ways, nuns were the quiet pioneers of healthy sleep boundaries. They made their own decisions when they could. They whispered their prayers. They wrote poetry about stillness and silence. And unlike their male counterparts, very few of them seemed eager to beat their personal sleep records. They were busy, faithful, tired, and sensible. Perhaps the most underrated spiritual quality of all. Part 8. The Peaceful Sleep of Pilgrims. In the Middle Ages, it was not unusual for someone to stand up in the middle of an ordinary day, wipe their hands on their apron or tunic, and announce, not with drama, but with quiet certainty, that they were going on a pilgrimage. This meant, broadly speaking, that they would walk somewhere for a very long time, usually to visit a saint's shrine or a holy well, or a cathedral that promised forgiveness or healing, or at the very least a good excuse to leave town for a few months. And at the end of each long walking day, there would be sleep. The pilgrim's sleep was not like the sleep of the noble, or the monk, or the housewife. It was earned not through toil in the fields, or work in the house, or the ringing of bells, but through the gentle ache of a day's journey done. Pilgrims walked on earth paths and cobbled roads, through woods, past chapels, over bridges, and occasionally around bridges, if they didn't trust the planks. They passed inns, stables, barns, and sometimes shrines that looked more like someone had nailed a tin cup to a fence and called it sacred. At night, they would seek shelter, sometimes in proper lodgings, but often in abbeys, priories, or small religious guest houses, who took pilgrims in as part of their duty to the world. There are records, lovely mundane records, of pilgrims being offered a bowl of warm broth, a clean place to wash their feet, and then a place to sleep. Not luxurious, but safe. Always safe. Pilgrims often slept in rooms with others, not because they particularly liked the sound of communal breathing, but because that was how it was. And over time, it became comforting. If someone woke in the night, they might hear the slow, even breathing of the stranger beside them, and take it as proof that the world, despite everything, was still functioning. There are letters from abbots in the 13th century reporting how pilgrims slept long and peacefully, often with a note that none disturbed them. One even added that they took no issue with the hay, which may be the closest thing to a 5-star review available in that century. Pilgrims rarely traveled alone for long. They met others on the road. A widow from Kent, a young mason's apprentice from Ghent, a woman walking barefoot out of stubbornness, or perhaps a kind merchant who always seemed to have a bit of dried apple to share. These companions came and went, but the walking rhythm remained, and so did the sleep. Quiet, rhythmic, reliable. There were no alarms, no night shifts, no deadlines, except the slow pull of the destination. Santiago, Rome, Canterbury, or the small chapel 3 towns over, where someone's grandfather once felt the presence of God. They laid down their heads each night, with nothing urgent left to do. And that, perhaps, is the most restful state of all. Part 9 of Tudors, Thinkers, and Sleep by Candlelight. By the time the Renaissance was in full swing, say the late 15th to early 17th century, sleep was beginning to be noticed not only by peasants and priests, but also by people with quills and expensive shoes. Scholars, physicians, poets, and astrologers began to wonder aloud, what is sleep? Not just, when do I sleep, which had been the primary question for several thousand years, but what is it made of? Where does the mind go? Can too much sleep make you stupid? Yes, said some. No, said others. Depends on the weather, said most. In Tudor England, the ordinary citizen continued to sleep in segments, much like their medieval ancestors. First sleep, wakeful hour, second sleep. But now there were more books about it, or at least books that mentioned it between long sections on how to cure gout with garlic and rubies. People still said their prayers, still banked their fires, still shared their beds. But now they might also consult an almanac to see if the moon was in the correct phase for restful slumber, or whether Venus was up to her old tricks again. There was a rising belief, gently absurd but widely held, that the position of the stars could determine whether you would sleep well on a Tuesday. a court physician in Henry VIII's time, once noted that the king preferred an early rising, though he admitted, cautiously, that the king's early rising was dependent on whether he'd eaten too much roast goose the night before. There is, tragically, no known record of how Anne Boleyn slept, though one can assume nervously toward the end. Meanwhile, in cities like Florence and Venice, sleep was becoming slightly more stylized. Wealthier families hung heavy curtains around their sleeping areas, not just to keep out drafts, but also to feel important. Diaries from the time mention people being awoken by church bells, singing apprentices, and the sound of one's neighbor's cat having ideas. There is one Venetian letter that complains of a man who rose too early and sang to his bread. Still, even the literate, wig-wearing ones still treated sleep as a natural rhythm, not a performance. If one was tired, one slept. If one awoke in the night, one might light a candle, read for a little while, and then return to rest. No one yet had invented the concept of sleep anxiety, which was an achievement of a much later, more caffeinated age. But while Middle Europe fiddled with feather beds and debated whether melancholia was a real condition or just a side effect of onions, other parts of the world had already developed deep, often wiser understandings of rest. And so, in our next section, we will quietly turn our gaze eastward to lands where sleep was not feared nor controlled, nor endlessly divided into moral categories, often seen as part of the greater harmony of the world. Part 10. The Stillness of the East. In much of traditional Chinese philosophy, sleep was seen as part of the body's harmonious cycle, not a problem to be solved. The ancient text, known as the Huang Dai Nei Jing, or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Classic, written well over 2,000 years ago, contains entire passages on how the body should align with the movements of nature. The advice is often beautifully simple. Rise with the sun. Sleep with the darkness. And do not trouble the mind too much in the evening. It does not mention inboxes or streaming services, but you get the idea. One recommendation from the text suggests that in winter one should go to bed earlier and wake later to protect the yin. Imagine that. A medical justification for sleeping in. And not just on Sundays. Across the sea in Japan, centuries of cultural tradition treated sleep not as indulgence, but as a natural interval in the unfolding of the day. In fact, there's a long-standing cultural notion, even to this day, that to fall asleep briefly in public, especially at work, is not shameful, but a sign of diligence. It's called inimuri, which means sleeping while present. The idea is that if someone dozes off at their desk, they must be working so hard that their bodies simply needed a pause. In Tudor England, that might get you fired. In Japan, it might get you respected. But private sleep, too, was treated with care. In many households, futons were rolled out at night and stored in cupboards by day, allowing sleeping space and waking space to share the same floor. It created a kind of intentionality. You didn't fall into bed. You prepared the room for rest. In India, spiritual traditions going back thousands of years placed enormous value on the inner quiet that sleep resembles, or in some cases reveals. Within Ayurvedic practice, sleep was considered one of the 3 pillars of health, alongside diet and routine. It was not something to squeeze in when possible, but something to be respected, like digestion or dignity. There were recommendations for bedtime stories, for sleeping on one's left side, for avoiding heavy food before rest, many of which now appear with only slightly more branding in Western wellness blogs. Yogic teachings, too, spoke of a fourth state of consciousness, Turiya, beyond waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. It was said to be a state of pure awareness, impossible to describe, and best not rushed, like a really, really good nap. Even in places where the climate shaped sleep, like hotter parts of Southeast Asia, where midday rest was customary, sleep was built into the day without argument. You didn't need permission. You needed shade. This idea that sleep could come naturally, periodically, and without ceremony, was oddly radical when compared to the bell-ringing habits of monks, or the candle-lit anxieties of scholars. In many Eastern traditions, sleep was not spiritual warfare or bodily failure. It was simply part of being human, a natural pause, a daily return to peace, the body's way of aligning itself with something wiser than clocks. Part 11. Sleep under the gaze of progress. By the 1800s, everything had changed except for human biology, which, inconveniently, had not. People still needed sleep, but now they were being watched while they needed it. This was the century of factories, rail timetables, time clocks, and urgency. Gaslight allowed people to work after dark. Street lamps spread across cities like glowing ambition. The night, once a time for soft silence and slow dreams, became simply after hours. And with this, the great undoing of segmented sleep began. Doctors, ever enthusiastic about reclassifying things, began to suggest that waking in the middle of the night, which people had done quite naturally for centuries, was now a problem, a sign of stress, a symptom, a thing to be cured. Never mind that until quite recently, it had been as normal as hearing the church bell or tying one's shoes. A man in Yorkshire wrote to a friend in 1838, saying he had awoken at 2 in the morning and read a few chapters of Robinson Crusoe before returning to sleep. "This is becoming a habit," he said. "I worry it reflects a weak constitution." His friend replied, "I do the same. We are perhaps both unfit for rail travel." There was concern. There was always concern. Sleep advice proliferated. Books on the correct position for dreaming. Diagrams of the spine. Odd little gadgets that promised to keep your jaw in place. By the late 19th century, sleep had become a project. Middle-class people began reading about ideal sleep environments, which in 1882 included one open window, but only a crack, a jug of water beside the bed, a complete lack of excitement after 6 p.m., the absence of cats. Servants, of course, were expected to continue rising early and sleeping late, preferably without complaint. Factory workers learned to sleep in shifts. There were even reports of miners sleeping while standing, which was admired by some and quietly pitied by others. And yet, despite all this noise, they slept. A letter from a woman in Bath in 1871 describes how, after the house was quiet and the fire had faded, she would sit in her chair, wrapped in a shawl, and feel the great weight of the day drift away. "I do not race toward my bed," she wrote. "I arrive there." It is a good sentence, perhaps the best sleep advice of the century. Part 12. The Sleep We Remember. In the modern world, sleep has become something we chase, a thing to be optimized, tracked, improved, cured, stretched, shortened, and in some cases monetized with soothing playlists and lavender-scented eye masks made in a factory in Belgium. We now ask sleep to perform for us, to make us younger, smarter, nicer. We install apps We wear rings. We read books with titles like Sleep Better Tonight and The 4-Hour Sleep Week, as if sleep were a new invention we're still getting the hang of. And yet, despite all this newness, there is something very old underneath it all, something unchanged. Because the truth is, sleep has always been there, before the factories, before the monks, before the philosophers, and the folk charms, and the olive oil lamps, before even language. It is not a new need. It is a return, a going back to something we have always known. It has been divided and recombined, hidden and studied, interrupted and restored, but never erased. And in small ways, some of the old patterns remain. People still wake in the night and find the darkness kind. Some still nap in the afternoon and call it thinking. We close our eyes, not because we've been told to, but because we are human, and we are tired, and the night is here. There is something reassuring in the thought that everyone, everywhere, eventually sleeps. The nurse, the violinist, the baker, the bus driver, the child, the astronomer, the historian, even me. No matter how fast the world becomes, the body insists on slowness. No matter how many hours are demanded of us, there is still a part of the day when we do not perform, when we do not answer, when we lie down and we let go. So, here we are. You have traveled through the sleep of emperors and peasants, of monks and merchants, of abbesses and pilgrims and letter writers and scholars. You have seen sleep feared, shaped, shared, and sacred. And now, perhaps, it is time for your own sleep. No bells will wake you, no matins to attend, no candle to snuff, nothing left to finish, only the quiet company of a history you now carry, not in your mind, but gently somewhere underneath it. So rest now. You've earned it.